Section 3 of The Broken Shaft, Tales in Mid-Ocean. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TJP 1421. The Broken Shaft, Tales in Mid-Ocean, edited by Henry Norman. Section 3, Markheim, by Robert Louis Stevenson. Yes, said the dealer, our windfalls are of various kinds. Some customers are ignorant, and then I touch a dividend on my superior knowledge. Some are dishonest. And here he held up the candle, so that the light fell strongly on his visitor. And in that case, he continued, I profit by my virtue. Markheim had but just entered from the daylight streets, and his eyes had not yet grown familiar with the mingled shine and darkness in the shop. At these pointed words, and before the near presence of the flame, he blinked painfully and looked aside. The dealer chuckled. You come to me on Christmas Day, he resumed, when you know that I am alone in my house, put up my shutters, and make a point of refusing business? Well, you will have to pay for that. You will have to pay for my derangement, when I should be balancing my books. You will have to pay besides for a kind of manner that I remark in you today, very strongly. I am the essence of discretion, and ask no awkward questions, but when a customer cannot look me in the eye, he has to pay for it. The dealer once more chuckled, and then, changing to his usual business voice, though still with a note of irony, You can give, as usual, a clear account of how you came into the possession of the object, he continued. Still your uncle's cabinet? A remarkable collection, sir. And the little, pale, round-shouldered dealer stood almost on tiptoe, looking over the top of his gold spectacles, and nodding his head with every mark of disbelief. Markheim returned his gaze with one of infinite pity and a touch of horror. This time, he said, you are in error. I have not come to sell, but to buy. I have no curios to dispose of. My uncle's cabinet is bare to the wainscot. Even were it still intact, I have done well on the stock exchange, and should more likely add to it than otherwise. My errand today is simplicity itself. I seek a Christmas present for a lady, he continued, waxing more fluent as he struck into the speech he had prepared. And certainly I owe you every excuse for thus disturbing you upon so small a matter. But the thing was neglected yesterday. I must produce my little compliment at dinner, and as you very well know, a rich marriage is not a thing to be neglected. Then followed a pause, during which the dealer seemed to weigh the statement incredulously. The ticking of many clocks among the curious lumber of the shop and the faint rushing of the cabs in a near thoroughfare filled up the interval of silence. Well, sir, said the dealer, be it so. You are an old customer after all, and if, as you say, you have the chance of a good marriage, far be it from me to be an obstacle. Here's a nice thing for a lady now, he went on. This hand glass, 15th century, warranted, comes from a good collection too, but I reserve the name in the interests of my customer, who was just like yourself, my dear sir, the nephew and sole heir of a remarkable collector. The dealer, while he thus ran on in his dry and biting voice, had stooped to take the object from its place, and, as he had done so, a shock had passed through Markheim, a start both of hand and foot, a sudden leap of many tumultuous passions to the face. It passed as swiftly as it came, and left no trace beyond a certain trembling of the hand that now received the glass. A glass? He said hoarsely, and then paused and repeated it more clearly. A glass? For Christmas? Surely not. And why not? Cried the dealer. Why not a glass? Markheim was looking upon him with an indefinable expression. You ask me why not, he said. Why, look here, look in it. Look at yourself. Do you like to see it? No, nor I, nor any man. The little man had jumped back when Markheim had so suddenly confronted him with the mirror, but now perceiving that there was nothing worse on hand, he chuckled. Your future lady, sir, must be pretty hard favored, said he.
No, said Markham with great conviction. But about you, I ask you for a Christmas present, and you give me this damned reminder of years and sins and follies, this hand conscience. Did you mean it? Had you a thought in your mind? Tell me. It will be better for you if you do. Come, tell me about yourself. I hazard a guess now that you are in secret a very charitable man.
The dealer looked closely at his companion. It was very odd. Markheim did not appear to be laughing. There was something in his face like an eager sparkle of hope, but nothing of mirth. What are you driving at? The dealer asked.
Not charitable, returned the other gloomily. Not charitable. Not pious. Not scrupulous. Unloving. Unbeloved. A hand to get money. A safe to keep it in. Is that all? Dear God, man, is that all?
I will tell you what it is, began the dealer, with some sharpness, and then broke off again into a chuckle. But I see, this is a love match of yours, and you have been drinking the lady's health.
Ah!
cried Markham, with a strange curiosity.
Ah! Have you been in love? Tell me about that.
I? cried the dealer. I in love? I never had the time, nor have I the time today for all this nonsense. Will you take the glass?
Where is the hurry? returned Markham. It is very pleasant to stand here talking, and life is so short and insecure that I would not hurry away from any pleasure. No, not even from so mild a one as this. We should rather cling to what little we can get, like a man at a cliff's edge. Every second is a cliff. If you think upon it, a cliff a mile high, high enough, if we fall, to dash us out of every feature of humanity. Hence it is best to talk pleasantly. Let us talk of each other. Why should we wear this mask? Let us be confidential. Who knows, we might become friends.
I have just one word to say to you, said the dealer. Either make your purchase, or walk out of my shop.
True, said Markham. Enough fooling. To business. Show me something else.
The dealer stooped once more, this time to replace the glass upon the shelf, his thin blonde hair falling over his eyes as he did so. Markheim moved a little nearer. With one hand in the pocket of his greatcoat, he drew himself up and filled his lungs. At the same time, many different emotions were depicted together on his face: terror, horror, and resolve, fascination, and a physical repulsion, and through a haggard lift of his upper lip his teeth looked out. This perhaps may suit, observed the dealer, and then, as he began to re-arise, Markham bounded from behind upon his victim. The long skewer-like dagger flashed and fell. The dealer struggled like a hen, striking his temple on the shelf, and then tumbled on the floor in a heap. Time had some score of small voices in that shop, some stately and slow, as was becoming to their great age, others garrulous and hurried. All these told out the seconds in an intricate chorus of tickings. Then the passage of a lad's feet, heavily running on the pavement, broke in upon these smaller voices and startled Markheim into the consciousness of his surroundings. He looked about him awfully. The candle stood on the counter, in its flame solemnly wagging in a draught, and, by that inconsiderable movement, the whole room was filled with noiseless bustle, and kept heaving like a sea, the tall shadows nodding, the gross blots of darkness swelling and dwindling as with respiration, the faces of the portraits and the china gods changing and wavering like images in water. The inner door stood ajar, and peered into that leaguer of shadows with a long slit of daylight like a pointing finger. From these fear-stricken rovings, Markheim's eyes returned to the body of his victim, where it lay both humped and sprawling, incredibly small and strangely meaner than in life. In these poor miserly clothes, in that ungainly attitude, the dealer lay like so much sawdust. Markheim had feared to see it, and lo, it was nothing. And yet, as he gazed, the This bundle of old clothes and pool of blood began to find eloquent voices. There it must lie. There was none to work the cunning hinges or direct the miracle of locomotion. There it must lie till it was found. Found, aye, and then? Then would this dead flesh lift up a cry that would echo over England, and fill the world with the echoes of pursuit. Aye, dead or not, this was still the enemy. Time. Was that when the brains were out, he thought. And the first word struck into his mind. Time. Now that the deed was accomplished, time, which had closed for the victim, had become instant and momentaneous for the slayer. The thought was yet in his mind when, first one and then another, with every variety of pace and voice, one deep as the bell from a cathedral turret, another ringing on its treble notes, the prelude of a waltz. The clocks began to strike the hour of 3 in the afternoon. The sudden outbreak of so many tongues in that dumb chamber staggered him. He began to bestir himself, going to and fro with the candle, beleaguered by moving shadows, and startled to the soul by chance reflections. In many rich mirrors, some of home design, some from Venice or Amsterdam, he saw his face repeated and repeated, as it were an army of spies. His own eyes met and detected him, and the sound of his own steps, lightly as they fell, vexed the surrounding quiet. And still, as he continued to fill his pockets, his mind accused him with a sickening iteration of the 1,000 faults of his design. He should have chosen a more quiet hour. He should have prepared an alibi. He should have not used a knife. He should have been more cautious, and only bound and gagged the dealer, and not killed him. He should have been more bold, and killed the servant also. He should have done all things otherwise. Poignant regrets, weary, incessant toiling of the mind to change what was unchangeable, to plan what was now useless, to be the architect of the irrevocable past. Meanwhile, and behind all this activity, brute terrors, like the scurrying of rats in a deserted attic, filled the more remote chambers of his brain with riot. The hand of the constable would fall heavy on his shoulder, and his nerves would jerk like a hooked fish. Or he beheld, in galloping defile, the dock, the prison, the gallows, and the black coffin. Terror of the people in the street sat down before his mind like a besieging army. It was impossible, he thought, but that some rumor of the struggle must have reached their ears and set on edge their curiosity. And now, in all the neighboring houses, he divined them sitting motionless and with uplifted ear, solitary people, condemned to spend Christmas dwelling alone on memories of the past, and now startlingly recalled from that tender exercise. Happy family parties struck into silence round the table, the mother still with raised finger. Every degree and age and humor, but all, by their own hearths, prying and hearkening and weaving the rope that was to hang him. Sometimes it seemed to him he could not move too softly. The clink of the tall Bohemian goblets rang out loudly like a bell, and, alarmed by the bigness of the ticking, he was tempted to stop the clocks. And then, again, with a swift transition of his terrors, the very silence of the house appeared a source of peril, and a thing to strike and freeze the passer-by. And he would step more boldly, and bustle aloud among the contents of the shop, and imitate, with elaborate bravado, the movements of a busy man at ease in his own house. But he was now so pulled about by different alarms that, while one portion of his mind was still alert and cunning, another trembled on the brink of lunacy. One hallucination in particular took a strong hold on his credulity. The neighbor, hearkening with white face beside his window, the passer-by arrested by a horrible surmise on the pavement. These could at worst suspect. They could not know. Through the brick walls and shuttered windows only sounds could penetrate. But here, within the house, was he alone? He knew he was. He had watched the servant set forth, sweethearting, in her poor best, out for the day, written in every ribbon and smile. Yes, he was alone, of course. And yet, in the bulk of empty house above him, he could surely hear a stir of delicate footing. He was surely conscious, inexplicably conscious of some presence. Aye, surely, to every room and corner of the house his imagination followed it, and now it was a faceless thing that yet had eyes to see with, and again it was a shadow of himself, and yet again, behold the image of the dead dealer, re-inspired with cunning and hatred. At times, with a strong effort, he would glance at the open door, which still seemed to repel his eyes. The house was tall, the skylight small and dirty, the day blind with fog, and the light that filtered down to the ground story was exceeding faint, and showed dimly on the threshold of the shop. And yet, in that strip of doubtful brightness, did there not hang wavering a shadow? Suddenly, from the street outside, a very jovial gentleman began to beat with a staff on the shop door, accompanying his blows with shouts and railleries in which the dealer was continually called upon by name. Markheim, smitten into ice, glanced at the dead man. But no, he lay quite still. He was fled away far beyond earthshot of these blows and shoutings. He was sunk beneath seas of silence, and his name, which would once have caught his notice above the howling of a storm, had become an empty sound. And presently the jovial gentleman desisted from his knocking and departed. Here was a broad hint to hurry what remained to be done, to get forth from this accusing neighborhood, to plunge into a bath of London multitudes, and to reach, on the other side of day, that haven of safety and apparent innocence, his bed. One visitor had come. At any moment another might follow and be more obstinate. To have done the deed and yet not to reap the profit would be too abhorrent a failure. The money, that was now Markheim's concern, and as a means to that, the keys. He glanced over his shoulder at the open door, where the shadow was still lingering and shivering, and with no conscious repugnance of the mind, yet with a tremor of the belly, he drew near the body of his victim. The human character had quite departed. Like a suit half stuffed with bran, the limbs lay scattered, the trunk doubled on the floor, and yet the thing repelled him. Although so dingy and inconsiderable to the eye, he feared it might have more significance to the touch. He took the body by the shoulders and turned it on its back. It was strangely light and supple, and the limbs, as if they had been broken, fell into the oddest postures. The face was robbed of all expression, but it was as pale as wax, and shockingly smeared with blood about one temple. That was, for Markheim, the one displeasing circumstance. It carried him back upon the instant to a certain fair day in a fisher's village, a grey day, a piping wind, a crowd upon the street, the blare of brasses, the booming of drums, the nasal voice of a ballad singer, and a boy going to and fro, buried overhead in the crowd and divided between interest and fear, until, coming out upon the chief place of concourse, he beheld a booth and a great screen with pictures, dismally designed, garishly colored. Brownrigg with her apprentice, the Mannings with their murdered guest, Weir in the death grip of Thurtell, and a score besides of famous crimes. The thing was as clear as an illusion. He had shrunk back into that little boy. He was looking once again, and with the same sense of physical revolt, at these vile pictures. He was still stunned by the thumping of the drums. A bar of that day's music returned upon his memory, and at that, for the first time, a qualm came over him, a breath of nausea, a sudden weakness of the joints, which he must instantly resist and conquer. He judged it more prudent to confront than to flee from these considerations. Looking the more heartily in the dead face, bending his mind to realize the nature and the greatness of his crime. So little a while ago that face had moved with every change of sentiment, that pale mouth had spoken, that body had been all on fire with governable energies. And now, and by his act, that piece of life had been arrested, as the horologist with interjected fingers arrests the beating of the clock. So he reasoned in vain. He could rise to no remorseful consciousness. The same heart which had shuddered before the painted effigies of crime looked on its reality unmoved. At best, he felt a gleam of pity for one who had been endowed in vain with all those faculties that can make the world a garden of enchantment, one who had never lived and who was now dead. But of penitence? No, not a tremor. With that, shaking himself clear of these considerations, he found the keys and advanced toward the open door of the shop. Outside, it had begun to rain smartly, and the sound of the shower upon the roof had banished silence. Like some dripping cavern, the chambers of the house were haunted by a faint, incessant echoing, which filled the ear and mingled with the ticking of the clocks. And, as Markheim approached the door, he seemed to hear, in answer to his own cautious tread, the steps of another foot withdrawing up the stair. The shadow still palpitated loosely on the threshold. He threw a ton's weight of resolve upon his muscles and drew back the door. The faint, foggy daylight glimmered dimly on the bare floor and stairs, on the bright suit of armor posted, halberd in hand, upon the landing, and on the dark wood carvings and framed pictures that hung against the yellow panels of the wainscot. So loud was the beating of the rain through all the house that, in Markheim's ears, it began to be distinguished into many different sounds. Footsteps and sighs, the tread of regiments marching in the distance, the chink of money in the counting, and the creaking of doors held stealthily ajar, appeared to mingle with the patter of the drops upon the cupola and the gushing of the water in the pipes. The sense that he was not alone grew upon him to the verge of madness. On every side he was haunted and begirt by presences. He heard them moving stealthily in the upper chambers. From the shop, he heard the dead man getting to his legs, and as he began with a great effort to mount the stairs, feet fled quietly before him and followed gradually behind. If he were but deaf, he thought, how tranquilly he would possess his soul. Then again, and hearkening with ever fresh attention, he blessed himself for that unresting sense which held the outposts and stood a trusted sentinel upon his life. His head turned continually on his neck. His eyes, which seemed starting from their orbits, scouted on every side, and on every side were half rewarded as with the tail of something nameless vanishing. 24 steps to the first floor were 24 agonies. On that first story, the doors stood ajar, 3 of them, like 3 ambushes, shaking his nerves like the throats of cannon. He could never again, he felt, be sufficiently immured and fortified from men's observing eyes. The sole joy for which he longed was to be home, girt in by walls, buried among bedclothes, and invisible to all but God. And at that thought, he wondered a little, recollecting tales of other murderers, and the fear they said to entertain of heavenly avengers. It was not so, at least with him. He feared the laws of nature, lest in their callous and immutable procedure they should preserve some damning evidence of his crime. He feared tenfold more, with slavish, superstitious terror, some scissions in the continuity of man's experience, some willful illegality of nature. He played a game of skill, depending on the rules, calculating consequence from cause, and what if nature, as the defeated tyrant overthrew the chessboard, should break the mold of their succession? The like had befallen Napoleon, so writers said, when the winter changed the time of its appearance. The like might befall Markheim. The solid walls might become transparent and reveal his doings like those of bees in a glass hive. The stout planks might yield under his feet like quicksands and detain him in their clutch. Aye, and there were soberer accidents that might destroy him. If, for instance, the house should fall and imprison him beside the body of his victim, or the house next door should fly on fire and the firemen invade him from all sides. These things he feared, and, in a sense, these things might be called the hands of God reached forth against sin. But about God himself he was at ease. His act was, doubtless, exceptional, but so were his excuses, which God knew. It was there, and not among men, that he felt sure of justice. When he had got safe into the drawing-room and shut the door behind him, he was aware of a respite from alarms. The room was quite dismantled, uncarpeted besides, and strewn with packing cases and incongruous furniture, several great pier glasses in which he beheld himself at various angles, like an actor on a stage. Many pictures, framed and unframed, standing with their faces to the wall. A fine Sheraton sideboard, a cabinet of marquetry, and a great old bed with tapestry hangings. The windows opened to the floor, but, by great good fortune, the lower part of the shutters had been closed, and this concealed him from the neighbors. Here, then, Markheim drew in a packing case before the cabinet, and began to search among the keys. It was a long business, for there were many, and it was irksome besides, for, after all, there might be nothing in the cabinet, and time was on the wing. But the closeness of the occupation sobered him. With the tail of his eye he saw the door, even glanced at it from time to time directly, like a besieged commander pleased to verify the good estate of his defenses. But in truth he was at peace. The rain falling in the street sounded natural and pleasant. Presently, on the other side, the notes of a piano were wakened to the music of a hymn, and the voices of many children took up the air and words. How stately, how comfortable was the melody, how fresh the youthful voices! Markheim gave ear to it smilingly, as he sorted out the keys, and his mind was thronged with answerable ideas and images. Church-going children and the pealing of the high organ, children afield, bathers by the brookside, ramblers on the brambly common, kite-flyers in the windy and cloud-navigated sky, and then, at another cadence of the hymn, back again to church, and the somnolence of summer Sundays, and the high genteel voice of the parson, which he smiled a little to recall, and the painted Jacobean tombs, and the dim lettering of the 10 Commandments on the chancel. And as he sat thus, at once busy and absent, he was startled to his feet. A flash of ice, a flash of fire, a bursting gush of blood went over him, and then he stood transfixed and thrilling. A step mounted the stair, slowly and steadily, and presently a hand was laid upon the knob, and the lock clicked, and the door opened. Fear held Markheim in a vice. What to expect he knew not, whether the dead man walking, or the official ministers of human justice, or some chance witness blindly stumbling in to consign him to the gallows. But when a face was thrust into the aperture, glanced round the room, looked at him, nodded and smiled as if in friendly recognition, and then withdrew again, and the door closed behind it, his fear broke loose from his control in a hoarse cry. At the sound of this, the visitant returned. "Did you call me?" he asked pleasantly, and with that he entered the room, and closed the door behind him. But Markheim stood and gazed at him with all his eyes. Perhaps there was a film upon his sight, but the outlines of the newcomer seemed to change and waver like those of the idols in the wavering candlelight of the shop. At times he thought he knew him, and at times he thought he bore a likeness to himself. And always, like a lump of living terror, there lay in his bosom the conviction that this thing was not of the earth and not of God. And yet the creature had a strange air of the commonplace as he stepped in and stood looking on Markheim with a smile. And when he added, "You're looking for the money, I believe?" it was in the tones of everyday politeness. Markheim made no answer. "I should warn you," resumed the other, "that the maid has left her sweetheart earlier than usual, and will soon be here. If Mr. Markham be found in this house, I need not describe to him the consequences."
"You know me?"
cried the murderer. The visitor smiled. "You have long been a favorite of mine," he said. "I have long observed, and often sought to help you."
"What are you?" cried Markham. "The devil?"
"What I may be," returned the other, "cannot affect the service I propose to render to you."
"It can," cried Markham. "It does. Be helped by you? No, never, not by you. You do not know me yet. Thank God, you do not know me."
"I know you. replied the visitant with a sort of kind severity, or rather firmness. I know you to the soul.
Know me? Cried Markham. Who can do so? My life is but a travesty and slander on myself. I have lived to belie my nature. All men do. All men are better than this disguise that grows about and stifles them. You see each dragged away by life, like one whom bravos have seized and muffled in a cloak. If they had their own control, if you could see their faces, they would be altogether different. They would shine out for heroes and saints. I am worse than most. Myself is more overlaid. My excuse is known to me and God. But had I the time, I could disclose myself.
To me? Inquired the visitant.
To you, before all, returned the murderer. I supposed you were intelligent. I thought, since you exist, you would prove a reader of the heart. And yet you would propose to judge me by my acts? Think of it, my acts. I was born and I have lived in the land of giants. Giants have dragged me by the wrist since I was born out of my mother, the giants of circumstance. And you would judge me by my acts. Can you not look within? Can you not understand that evil is hateful to me? Can you not see within me the clear writing of conscience, never blurred by any wilful sophistry, although too often disregarded? Can you not read me for a thing that surely must be common as humanity, the unwilling sinner?
All this is very feelingly expressed, was the reply, but it regards me not. These points of consistency are beyond my province, and I care not in the least by what compulsion you may have been dragged away, so as you are but carried in the right direction. But time flies, the servant delays, looking in the faces of the crowd and at the pictures on the hoardings, but still she keeps moving nearer, and remember, it is as if the gallows itself was striding toward you through the Christmas streets. Shall I help you? I, who know all? Shall I tell you where to find the money?
For what price? Asked Markham.
I offer you the service for a Christmas gift, returned the other. Markham could not refrain from smiling with a kind of bitter triumph.
No, said he, I will take nothing at your hands. If I were dying of thirst, and it was your hand that put the pitcher to my lips, I should find the courage to refuse it. It may be credulous, but I will do nothing to commit myself to evil.
I have no objection to a deathbed repentance, observed the visitant.
Because you disbelieve their efficacy, Markham cried.
I do not say so, returned the other, but I look on these things from a different side, and when the life is done, my interest falls. The man has lived to serve me, to spread black looks under color of religion, or to sow tares in the wheat field, as you do, in a course of weak compliance with desire. Now that he draws so near to his deliverance, he can add but one act of service: to repent, to die smiling, and thus to build up in confidence and hope the more timorous of my surviving followers. I am not so hard a master. Try me. Accept my help. Please yourself in life as you have done hitherto. Please yourself more amply. Spread your elbows at the board, and when the night begins to fall and the curtains to be drawn, I tell you, for your greater comfort, that you will find it even easy to compound your quarrel with your conscience, and to make a truckling peace with God. I came but now from such a deathbed, and the room was full of sincere mourners, listening to the man's last words, and when I looked into that face, which had been set as a flint against mercy, I found it smiling with hope.
And do you then suppose me such a creature? Asked Markham. Do you think I have no more generous aspirations than to sin and sin and sin, and at the last sneak into heaven? My heart rises at the thought. Is this then your experience of mankind? Or is it because you find me with red hands that you presume such baseness? And is this crime of murder indeed so impious as to dry up the very springs of good?
Murder is to me no special category, replied the other. All sins are murder, even as all life is war. I behold your race, like starving mariners on a raft, plucking crusts out of the hands of famine and feeding on each other's lives. I follow sins beyond the moment of their acting. I find in all that the last consequence is death. And, to my eyes, the pretty maid who thwarts her mother with such taking graces on a question of a ball drips no less visibly with human gore than such a murderer as yourself. Do I say that I follow sins? I follow virtues also. They differ not by the thickness of a nail. They are both sighs for the reaping angel of death. Evil, for which I live, consists not in action but in character. The bad man is dear to me. Not the bad act, whose fruits, if we could follow them far enough down the hurtling cataracts of the ages, might yet be found more blessed than those of the rarest virtues. And it is not because you have killed a dealer, but because your name is Markheim, that I offer to forward your escape.
I will lay my heart open to you, answered Markheim. This crime on which you find me is my last. On my way to it I have learned many lessons. Itself is a lesson, a momentous lesson. Hitherto I have been driven with revolt to what I would not. I was a bond slave to poverty, driven and scourged. There are robust virtues that can stand in these temptations. Mine was not so. I had a thirst of pleasure. But today, and out of this deed, I pluck both warning and riches, both the power and a fresh resolve to be myself. I become in all things a free actor in the world. I begin to see myself all changed, these hands the agents of good, this heart at peace. Something comes over me out of the past, something of what I have dreamed on Sabbath evenings to the sound of the church organ, of what I forecast when I shed tears over noble books, or talked, an innocent child, with my mother. There lies my life. I have wandered a few years, but now I see once more my city of destination. You are to use this money on the stock exchange, I think, remarked the visitor. And there, if I mistake not, have you already lost some thousands? Ah, said Markham, but this time I have a sure thing.
This time, again, you will lose, replied the visitor quietly.
Ah, but I keep back the half, cried Markham.
That also you will lose, said the other. The sweat started upon Markheim's brow.
Well then, what matter? He exclaimed. Say it be lost. Say I am plunged again in poverty. Shall one part of me, and that the worst, continue until the end to override the better? Evil and good run strong in me, hailing me both ways. I do not love the one thing, I love all. I can conceive great deeds, renunciations, martyrdoms, and though I be fallen to such a crime as murder, pity is no stranger to my thoughts. I pity the poor, who know their trials better than myself. I pity and help them. I prize love. I love honest laughter. There is no good thing nor true thing on earth, but I love it from my heart. And are my vices only to direct my life, and my virtues to lie without effect, like some passive lumber of the mind? Not so. Good also is a spring of acts.
But the visitant raised a finger. For 36 years that you have been in this world, said he, through many changes of fortune and varieties of humor, I have watched you steadily fall. 15 years ago, you would have started at a theft. 3 years back, you would have blanched at the name of murder. Is there any crime, is there any cruelty or meanness from which you still recoil? 5 years from now, I shall detect you in the fact. Downward, downward lies your way, nor can anything but death avail to stop you.
It is true, he said huskily. I have in some degree complied with evil, but it is so with all. The very saints, in the mere exercise of living, grow less dainty and take on the tone of their surroundings.
I will propound to you one simple question, said the other, and as you answer, I shall read to you your moral horoscope. You have grown in many things more lax. Possibly you do right to be so, and at any account it is the same with all men. But granting that, Are you in any one particular, however trifling, more difficult to please with your own conduct, or do you go on in all things with a loose rein?
In any one?
Repeated Markham, with an anguish of consideration.
No,
he added with despair.
In none. I have gone down in all.
Then, said the visitor, content yourself with what you are, for you will never change, and the words of your part on this stage are irrevocably written down. Markham stood for a long while silent, and indeed it was the visitor who first broke the silence. That being so, he said, shall I show you the money?
And grace?
Cried Markheim. Have you not tried it? Returned the other. 2 or 3 years ago, did I not see you on the platform of revival meetings, and was not your voice the loudest in the hymn?
It is true, said Markham, and I see clearly what remains for me by the way of duty.
I thank you for these lessons. From my soul, my eyes are opened, and I behold myself at last for what I am. At this moment, the sharp note of the doorbell rang through the house, and at that the visitant, as though this were some concerted signal for which he had been waiting, sprang instantly upon his feet. The maid, he cried, she has returned as I forewarned you, and there is now before you one more difficult passage. Her master, you must say, is ill. You must let her in, with an assured but rather serious countenance. No smiles, no overacting, and I promise you success. Once the girl within, and the door closed, the same dexterity that has already rid you of the dealer will relieve you of this last danger in your path. Thenceforward you have the whole evening, the whole night, if needful, to ransack the treasures of the house and to make good your safety. This is help that comes to you with the mask of danger. Up, he cried. Up, friend! Your life hangs trembling in the scales. Up and act! Markham steadily regarded his counselor.
If I be condemned to evil acts, he said, there is still one door of freedom open. I can cease from action. If my life be an ill thing, I can lay it down. Though I be, as you say truly, at the beck of every small temptation, I can yet, by one decisive gesture, place myself beyond the reach of all. My love of good is damned to barrenness. It may, and let it be, but I still have my hatred of evil. From that to your galling disappointment, you shall see that I can draw both energy and courage.
The features of the visitor began to undergo a wonderful and lovely change. They brightened and softened with a tender triumph, and even as they brightened, faded and dislimed. But Markheim did not pause to watch or understand the transformation. He opened the door and went downstairs very slowly, thinking to himself. His past went soberly before him. He beheld it as it was, ugly and strenuous like a dream, random as chance medley, a scene of defeat. Life, as he thus reviewed it, tempted him no longer, but on the further side he perceived a quiet haven for his bark. He paused in the passage, and looked into the shop, where the candle still burned by the dead body. It was strangely silent. Thoughts of the dealer swarmed into his mind as he stood gazing, and then the bell once more broke out into an impatient clamor. He confronted the maid upon the threshold with something like a smile.
You had better go for the police, said he. I have killed your master.
There was another long pause at the end of the romancer's story, and no one seemed inclined to carry the debate between Mr. Markheim and his strange visitant beyond the point where the narrator had left it. The critic, indeed, meditatively slid in an epigram and whispered to the editor,
Poe, with a moral sense superadded, by Jove.
But that gentleman only frowned abstractedly.
It's gruesome,
growled the tragedian.
That jovial fellow battering at the gate, why, it reminds one of the knocking in Macbeth, and answers much the same purpose.
And he seemed to be making mental notes, with a view, as Mr. Gladstone would say, to future operations. Indeed, the story held the company with a strong fascination, and each member of it could not but feel glad that he could keep his face as well as his thoughts from his neighbor's curious gaze, as in the fast-gathering darkness he pondered on the strange problems it suggested. The train of half-melancholy, half-morbid speculation might have gone on for some time had it not been broken by the low "good night" of Beatrice as she glided, a dim mass of drapery, from the circle. There was no thought of further association after the star of that small society had withdrawn, and with one accord the party broke up. As the critic descended an hour later to the lower deck, he thought he caught a glimpse of the eminent tragedian making a wild pass in the air, which at once recalled the terrible deed in the dealer's shop. A warning cough, however, put a stop to these demonstrations, and when the critic approached his companion, the great man's face wore its usual impassive expression. Perhaps, after all, the flickering shadows had deceived him. The morning rose bright and clear, but it brought no relief to the belated passengers of the Bavaria. The long roll of the uncrested waves, as they moved slowly under and past the vessel, as if bent on some unknown and distant goal, seemed to remind them of their helpless condition, and the sight chafed the more active spirits into discontent. The captain was not approachable, and replied with unintelligible grunts to obsequious remarks about the weather. The critic said several words which, as Beatrice shook her finger at him reprovingly, were presumably in the Norwegian tongue. The editor read his Flaubert with something of a protest in his air. Those who kept diaries filled them up to date, and those who did not pretended they had already done so. The eminent tragedian paced the deck and smoked cigar after cigar in moody silence, the critic occasionally following him with rather fearful glances. Only the lady was charming as ever, and set her small court skimming over the decks and tumbling down the companion ladder on her behests, crowning all her audacities by dispatching the critic, a somewhat shy man, in search of the dreadful captain, with an imperative message to "come here at once, and tell us when are we going to get out of this." He came, and grimness was gentleness itself in that presence. By dint of these small expedients, time passed on, and brought the dinner hour with it, and as dinners on the Bavaria are as good as everything else on that model establishment, the company grew fairly cheerful again. After all, they were an excellent case. They might all be in search of a new Atlantis, an earthly paradise, with no devil to mar its bliss, a place where first nights were not, and chicken and champagne had never been heard of. So magnificently independent were they of old ties of business and pleasure. They had nothing to do but gently to climb up the climbing wave, and gently, with some slight qualms, it is true, to climb down again. And so they were merry, and the clever men said good things, quite as if they had just thought of them, and the ladies laughed. Oh, what a silvery laugh had Beatrice! And the soup was spilled into the awkward one's lap, and the wine went round. The meal over, the little knot, which had already found so much pleasure in one another's company, came together again, like bunches of drifting seaweed, and then again there was a pleasant interchange of jest and quip. Men's wits have a keener edge on them after dinner, and at length the call for a story. This time the demand was made of a youngish man, who, though a twinkling eye showed the humorist, had sat quiet and absorbed through the fun. "'Tis not a merry tale that is running in my head," said he. "I am never merry when I hear sweet music," quoth Beatrice with a little bow. "Madam," he replied, "the music that is in my ears is that of a young voice now still in death." And without further ado, he began. End of section 3. Recording by TJP 1421.
Section 4 of The Broken Shaft, Tales in Mid-Ocean. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Penn. The Broken Shaft, Tales in Mid-Ocean. Edited by Henry Norman. Marjorie by F. Anstey. It is not without an effort that I have resolved to break, in the course of this narrative, the reserve maintained for nearly 20 years. But the chief reason for silence is removed, now that those are gone who might have been pained or harmed by what I have to tell, and, though I shrink still from reviving certain memories that are fraught with pain, there are others associated therewith in which I shall surely find consolation and relief. I must have been about 11 at the time I am writing of, and the change which, for good or ill, comes over most boys' lives had not yet threatened mine. I had not left home for school, nor did it seem at all probable then that I should ever do so. When I read, I was a great reader. Of Dotheboys Hall and Salem House, a combination of which establishments formed my notion of school life, it was with no more personal interest than a cripple might feel in perusing the notice of an impending conscription, for from the battles of school life I was fortunately exempted. I was the only son of a widow, and we led a secluded life in a London suburb. My mother took charge of my education herself, and, as far as mere acquirements went, I was certainly not behind other boys of my age. I owe too much to that loving and careful training, heaven knows, to think of casting any reflection upon it here. But my surroundings were such as almost necessarily to exclude all bracing and hardening influences. My mother had few friends. We were content with our own companionship, and of boys I knew, and cared to know, nothing. In fact, I regarded a strange boy with much the same unreasoning aversion as many excellent women feel for the ordinary cow. I was happy to think that I should never be called upon to associate with them. By and by, when I outgrew my mother's teaching, I was to have a tutor, perhaps even go to college in time, and when I became a man I was to be a curate and live life with my mother in a clematis-covered cottage in some pleasant village. She would often dwell on this future with a tender prospective pride. She spoke of it on the very day that saw it shattered forever. For there came a morning when, on going to her with my lessons for the day, I was gladdened with an unexpected holiday. I little knew then, though I was to learn so soon, that my lessons had been all holidays, or that on that day they were to end forever. My mother had had one or two previous attacks of an illness which seemed to prostrate her for a short period, and as she soon regained her ordinary health, I did not think they could be of a serious nature. So I devoted my holiday cheerfully enough to the illumination of a text, on the gaudy coloring of which I found myself gazing 2 days later with a dull wonder, as at the work of a strange hand in a long dead past. For the boy who had painted that was a happy boy who had a mother, and for 2 endless days I had been alone. Those days, and many that followed, come back to me now but vaguely. I passed them mostly in a state of blank bewilderment, caused by the double sense of sameness and strangeness in everything around me. Then there were times when this gave way to a passionate anguish which refused all attempts at comfort, and times even, but very, very seldom, when I almost forgot what had happened to me. Our one servant remained in the house with me, and a friend and neighbor of my mother's was constant in her endeavors to relieve my loneliness. But I was impatient of them, I fear, and chiefly anxious to be left alone to indulge my melancholy unchecked. I remember how, as autumn began and leaf after leaf fluttered down from the trees in our little garden, I watched them fall with a heavier heart, for my mother had known them. And now they, too, were deserting me. This morbid state of mind had lasted quite long enough when my uncle, who was my guardian, saw fit to put a summary end to it by sending me to school forthwith. He would have softened the change for me by taking me to his own home first, but there was illness of some sort there, and this was out of the question. I was neither sorry nor glad when I heard of it, for all places were the same to me just then. Only, as the time drew near, I began to regard the future with a growing dread. The school was at some distance from London, and my uncle took me down by rail, but the only fact I remember connected with the journey is that there was a boy in the carriage with us who cracked walnuts all the way, and I wondered if he was going to school, too, and concluded that he was not, or he would hardly eat quite so many walnuts. Later, we were passing through some wrought iron gates and down an avenue of young chestnuts under a joyous canopy of scarlet, amber, and orange, up to a fine old red brick house, with a high-pitched brown roof and a cupola in which a big bell hung, tinted a warm gold by the afternoon sun. This was my school, and it did not look so very terrible after all. There was a big bow window by the pillared portico, and glancing timidly in, I saw a girl of about my own age sitting there, absorbed in the book she was reading, her long brown hair drooping over her cheek and the hand on which it rested. She glanced up at the sound of the doorbell, and I felt her eyes examining me seriously and critically, and then I forgot everything but the fact that I was being introduced to my future schoolmaster, the Reverend Basil Daring. This was less of an ordeal than I had expected. He had a strong, massively cut, leonine face, free and abundant white hair streaked with dark gray, but there was a kind light in his eyes as I looked up at them, and the firm mouth could smile, I found, pleasantly enough. Mrs. Daring seemed younger and, though handsome, had a certain stateliness and decision of manner which put me less at my ease, and I was relieved to be told I might say good-bye to my uncle and wander about the grounds as I liked. I was not surprised to pass through an empty schoolroom, and to descend by some steep stairs to a deserted playground, for we had been already told that the Michaelmas holidays were not over, and that the boys would not return for some days to come. It gave me a kind of satisfaction to think of my resemblance just then to my favorite, David Copperfield, but I was to have a far pleasanter companion than poor, lugubrious, flute-tootling Mr. Mell, for, as I paced the damp paths paved with a mosaic of russet and yellow leaves, I heard light footsteps behind me, and turned to find myself face to face with the girl I had seen at the window. She stood there breathless for an instant, for she had hurried to overtake me, and against a background of crimson creepers I saw the brilliant face, with its soft but fearless brown eyes, small, straight nose, spirited mouth, and crisp, wavy, golden-brown hair, which I see now as distinctly while I write. "You're the new boy," she said at length. "I've come out to make you feel more at home. I suppose you don't feel quite at home just yet." "Not quite, thank you," I said, lifting my cap with ceremony, for I had been taught to be particular about my manners. I have never been to school before, you see, Miss Daring. I think she was a little puzzled by so much politeness. "I know," she said softly. "Mother told me about it, and I'm very sorry. And I'm called Marjorie, generally. Shall you like school, do you think?" "I might," said I, if it wasn't for the boys." "Boys aren't bad," she said. "Ours are rather nice, I think. But perhaps you don't know many." "I know one," I replied. "How old is he?" she wished to know. "Not very old. About 3, I think," I said. I had never wished till then that my only male acquaintance had been of less tender years, but I felt now that he was rather small, and saw that Marjorie was of the same opinion. "Why, he's a baby," she said. "I thought you meant a real boy. And is that all the boys you know? Are you fond of games?" "Some games, very," said I. "What's your favorite game?" she demanded. "Bezique," I answered, "or draughts." "I mean outdoor games. Draughts are indoor games. Is indoor games, I mean. No, are an indoor game, and that doesn't sound grammar. But haven't you ever played cricket? Not ever, really? I like it dreadfully myself, only I'm not allowed to play with the boys, and I'm sure I can bat well enough for the second 11. Cartwright said I could last term, and I can bowl round hand, and it's all no use just because I was born a girl. Wouldn't you like a game at something? They haven't taken in the croquet hoops yet. Shall we play at that?" But again I had to confess my ignorance of what was then a popular garden game. What do you generally do to amuse yourself, then? She inquired. I read, generally, or paint texts or outlines. Sometimes, I thought this accomplishment would surely appeal to her, sometimes I do wool work. I don't think I would tell the boys that, she advised rather gravely. She evidently considered me a very desperate case. It's such a pity your not knowing any games. Suppose I taught you croquet now. It would be something to go on with, and you'll soon learn if you pay attention and do exactly what I tell you. I submitted myself meekly to her direction, and Marjorie enjoyed her office of instructress for a time, until my extreme slowness wore out her patience, and she began to make little outbursts of disgust, for which she invariably apologized. "That's enough for today," she said at last. "I'll take you again tomorrow. But you really must try and pick up games, Cameron, or you'll never be liked. Let me see. I wonder if there's time to teach you a little football. I think I could do that." Before she could make any further arrangements the tea bell rang. But when I lay down that night in my strange, cold bed, hemmed round by other beds, which were only less formidable than if they had been occupied, I felt less friendless than I might have done, and dreamed all night that Marjorie was teaching me something I understood to be cricket, which, however, was more like a bloated kind of backgammon. The next day Marjorie was allowed to go out walking with me, and I came home feeling that I had known her for quite a long time, while her manner to me had acquired a tone even more protecting than before, and she began to betray an anxiety as to my school prospects which filled me with uneasiness. "I am so afraid the boys won't like the way you talk," she said on one occasion. "I used to be told I spoke very correctly," I said, verdantly enough. "But not like boys talk. You see, Cameron, I ought to know, with such a lot of them about. I tell you what I could do, though. I could teach you most of their words, only I must run and ask Mother first, if I may. Teaching slang isn't the same as using it on my own account, is it?" Marjorie darted off impulsively to ask leave, to return presently with a slow step and downcast face. "I mayn't," she announced. "Mother says certainly not, so there's an end of that. Still, I think myself it's a decided pity." And more than once that day she would observe, as if to herself, "I do wish they had let you come to school in different collars." I knew that these remarks, and others of a similar tendency, were prompted by her interest in my welfare, and I admired her too heartily already to be offended by them. Still, I cannot say that they added to my peace of mind, and on the last evening of the holidays she said good night to me with some solemnity. "Everything will be different after this," she said. "I shan't be able to see nearly so much of you, because I'm not allowed to be much with the boys. But I shall be looking after you all the time, Cameron, and seeing how you get on. And, oh, I do hope you will try to be a popular kind of boy." I'm afraid I must own that this desire of Marjorie's was not realized. I do not know that I tried to be, and I certainly was not, a popular boy. The other boys, I now know, were by no means bad specimens of the English schoolboy, as will be evident when I state that, for a time, my deep mourning was held by them to give me a claim to their forbearance. But I had an unfortunate tendency to sudden floods of tears, apparently for no cause whatever, really from some secret spring of association, such as I remember was touched when I first found myself learning Latin from the same primer over which my mother and I had puzzled together. And these outbursts at first aroused my companions' contempt, and finally their open ridicule. I could not conceal my shrinking dislike to their society, which was not calculated to make them more favorably disposed toward me. While my tastes, my expressions, my ways of looking at things were all at total variance with their own standards. The general disapproval might well have shown itself in a harsher manner than that of merely ignoring my existence, and it says much for the tone of the school that it did not. Unfortunately, I felt their indifference almost as keenly as I had dreaded their notice. From my master I met with more favor, for I had been thoroughly well grounded, and found, besides, a temporary distraction in my schoolwork, but this was hardly likely to render me beloved by my fellows. And so it came to pass that every day saw my isolation more complete. Something, however, made me anxious to hide this from Marjorie's eyes, and whenever she happened to be looking on at us in the school grounds or the playing fields, I made dismal attempts to appear on terms of equality with the rest, and would hang about a group with as much pretense of belonging to it as I thought prudent. If she had had more opportunities of questioning me, she would have found me out long before. As it was, the only occasion on which I was near her was at the weekly drawing lesson, when, although she drew less and talked more than the professor quite approved of, she was obliged to restrict herself to a conversation which did not admit of confidences. But this negative, neutral-tinted misery was not to last. I was harmless enough, but then to some natures nothing is so offensive as inoffensiveness. My isolation was certain to raise me up an enemy in time, and he came in the person of one Clarence Ormsby. He was a sturdy, good-looking fellow, about 2 years older than myself, good at games, and, though not brilliant in other respects, rather idle than dull. He was popular in the school, and I believe his general disposition was by no means bad, but there must have been some hidden flaw in his nature, which might never have disclosed itself for any other but me. For me he had displayed, almost from the first, one of those special antipathies that want but little excuse to ripen into hatred. My personal appearance — I had the misfortune to be a decidedly plain boy — happened to be particularly displeasing to him, and, as he had an unsparing tongue, he used it to cover me with ridicule, until gradually, finding that I did not retaliate, he indulged in acts of petty oppression, which, though not strictly bullying, were more harassing and humiliating. I suspect now that if I had made ever so slight a stand at the outset, I should have escaped further molestation. But I was not pugnacious by nature, and never made the experiment. Partly, probably, from a theory on which I had been reared that all violence was vulgar, but chiefly from a tendency, unnatural in one of my age and sex, to find a sentimental satisfaction in a certain degree of unhappiness. So that I can neither pity myself nor expect pity from others for woes which were so essentially my own creation, though they resulted, alas, in misery that was not artificial. It was inevitable that quick-sighted Marjorie should discover the subjection into which I had fallen, and her enlightenment was brought about in this manner. Ormsby and I were together alone shortly before morning school, and he came toward me with an exercise of mine from which he had just been copying his own, for we were in the same classes, despite the difference in our ages, and he was in the habit of profiting thus by my industry. "Thanks, Cameron," he said with a sweetness which I distrusted, for he was not, as a rule, so lavish in his gratitude. "I've copied out that exercise of yours, but it's written so beastly badly that you'd better do it again." With which he deliberately tore the page he had been copying from to scraps, which he threw in my face, and strolled out and down to the playground. I was preparing submissively to do the exercise over again as well as I could in the short time that was left, when I was startled by a low cry of indignation, and looking around saw Marjorie standing in the doorway, and knew by her face that she had seen all. "Has Ormsby done that to you before?" she inquired. "Once or twice he has," said I. "And you let him?" she cried. "Oh, Cameron!" "What can I do?" I said. "I know what I would do," she replied. "I would slap his face, or pinch him. I wouldn't put up with it." "Boys don't slap one another, or pinch," I said, not displeased to find a weak place in her knowledge of us. "Well, they do something," she said. "A real boy would. But I don't think you are a real boy, Cameron. I'll show you what to do. Where's the exercise that pig copied? Ah, I see it. And now, look." Here she tore his page as he had torn mine. "Now for an envelope." And from the doctor's own desk she took an envelope in which she placed the fragments and wrote on the outside in her round childish hand, "With Marjorie's compliments for being a bully." "He won't do that again," she said gleefully. "He'll do worse," I said in dismay. "I shall have to pay for it. Marjory, why didn't you leave things alone? I didn't complain. You know I didn't." She turned upon me, as well she might, in supreme disdain. "Oh, what a coward you are! I wouldn't believe all Cartwright told me about you when I asked, but I see it's all true. Why don't you stick up for yourself?" I muttered something or other. "But you ought to. You'll never get on unless," said Marjory very decidedly. "Now, promise me you will next time." I sat there silent. I was disgusted with myself, and meanly angry with her for having rendered me so. "Then listen," she said impressively. "I promised I would look after you, and I did mean to, but it's no use if you won't help yourself. So, unless you say you won't go on being a coward any more, I shall have to leave you to go your own way, and not take the least interest in you ever again." "Then you may," I said stolidly. "I don't care." I wondered even while I spoke the words what could be impelling me to treat spirited, warm-hearted Marjory like that, and I hate myself still at the recollection. "Good bye, then," she said very quietly. "I'm sorry, Cameron." And she went out without another word. When Ormsby came in, I watched him apprehensively as he read the envelope upon his desk and saw its contents. He said nothing, however, though he shot a malignant glance in my direction. But the lesson was not lost upon him, for from that time he avoided all open ill treatment of me, and even went so far as to assume a friendliness which might have reassured me had I not instinctively felt that it masked the old dislike. I was constantly the victim of mishaps in the shape of missing and defaced books, ink mysteriously spilled or strangely adulterated, and, though I could never trace them to any definite hand, they seemed too systematic to be quite accidental. Still, I made no sign, and hoped thus to disarm my persecutor, if persecutor there were. As for my companions, I knew that in no case would they take the trouble to interfere on my behalf. They had held aloof from the first, the general opinion, which I now perceived was not unjust, being that I deserved all I got. And my estrangement from Marjory grew wider and wider. She never spoke to me now when we sat near one another at the drawing class. If she looked at me, it was by stealth, and with a glance that I thought sometimes was contemptuously pitiful, and sometimes half fancied betrayed a willingness to return to the old comradeship. But I nursed my stupid, sullen pride, though my heart ached with it at times, for I had now come to love Marjory devotedly, with a love that, though I was a boy and she was a child, was as genuine a passion as any I have felt since. The chance of seeing her now and then, of hearing her speak, though it was not to me, gave me the one interest in my life, which, but for her, I could not have borne. But this love of mine was a very far off and disinterested worship, after all. I could not imagine myself ever speaking of it to her, or picture her as accepting it. Marjory was too thoroughly a child to be vulgarized in that way, even in thought. The others were healthy, matter-of-fact youths, to whom Marjory was an ordinary girl, and who certainly did not indulge in any strained sentiment respecting her. It was left for me to idealize her, but of that, at least, I can not feel ashamed, or believe that it did me anything but good. And the days went on until it wanted but a fortnight to Christmas, and most of us were thinking of the coming holidays, and preparing with a not unpleasant excitement for the examinations, which were all that barred the way to them now. I was to spend my Christmas with my uncle and cousins, who would by that time be able to receive me. But I felt no very pleasurable anticipations, for my cousins were all boys, and from boys I thought I knew what to expect. One afternoon Ormsby came to me with the request that I would execute a trifling commission for him in the adjoining village. He himself, he said, was confined to bounds, but he had a shilling he wanted to lay out at a small fancy shop we were allowed to patronize, and he considered me the best person to be entrusted. I was simply to spend the shilling on anything I thought best, for he had entire confidence, he gave me to understand, in my taste and judgment. I think I suspected a design of some sort, but I did not dare to refuse. And then his manner to some extent disarmed me. I took the shilling, therefore, with which I bought some article, I forget what, and got back to the school at dusk. The boys had all gone down to tea except Ormsby, who was waiting for me up in the empty schoolroom. "Well?" he said, and I displayed my purchase, only to find that I had fallen into a trap. When I think how easily I was the dupe of that not too subtle artifice, which was only half malicious, I could smile, if I did not know how it ended. "How much was that?" he asked contemptuously. "2 pence halfpenny? Well, if you choose to give a shilling for it, I'm not going to pay, that's all. So just give me back my shilling." Now, as my weekly allowance consisted of 3 pence, which was confiscated for some time in advance, as I think he knew, to provide fines for my mysteriously stained dictionaries, this was out of the question, as I represented. "Then go back to the shop and change it," said he. "I won't have that thing. Tell me what you would like instead, and I will," I stipulated, not unreasonably. He laughed, his little scheme was working so admirably. "That's not the bargain," he said. "You're bound to get me something I like. I'm not obliged to tell you what it is." But even I was driven to protest against such flagrant unfairness. "I didn't know you meant that," I said, "or I'm sure I shouldn't have gone. I went to oblige you, Ormsby." "No, you didn't," he said. "You went because I told you. And you'll go again." "Not unless you tell me what I'm to get," I said. "I tell you what I believe," he said. "You never spent the whole shilling at all on that. You bought something for yourself with the rest, you young swindler. No wonder you won't go back to the shop." This was, of course, a mere taunt flung out by his inventive fancy, but as he persisted in it, and threatened exposure and a variety of consequences, I became alarmed, for I had little doubt that, innocent as I was, I could be made very uncomfortable by accusations which would find willing hearers. He stood there enjoying my perplexity, and idly twisting a piece of string round and round his fingers. At length he said, "Well, I don't want to be hard on you. You may go and change this for me even now, if you like. I'll give you 3 minutes to think it over, and you can come down into the playground when I sing out and tell me what you mean to do. And you had better be sharp in coming, too, or it will be the worse for you." He took his cap, and presently I heard him going down the steps to the playground. I would have given worlds to go and join the rest at tea, but I did not dare, and remained in the schoolroom, which was dim just then, for the gas was lowered, and while I stood there by the fireplace, trembling in the cold air which stole in through the door Ormsby had left open, Marjorie came in by the other one, and was going straight to her father's desk when she saw me. Her first impulse seemed to be to take no notice, but something in my face or attitude made her alter her mind and come straight to me, holding out her hand. "Cameron," she said, "shall we be friends again?" "Yes, Marjorie," I said. I could not have said any more just then. "You look so miserable. I couldn't bear it any longer," she said. "So I had to make it up. You know I was only pretending crossness, Cameron, all the time, because I really thought it was best, but it doesn't seem to have done you much good, and I did promise to take care of you. What is it? Ormsby again?" "Yes," I said, and told her the story of the commission. "Oh, you stupid boy!" she cried. "Couldn't you see he only wanted to pick a quarrel? And if you change it now, he'll make you change it again, and the next time, and the next after that. I know he will." Here Ormsby's voice shouted from below. "Now then, you Cameron, time's up." "What is he doing down there?" asked Marjorie, and her indignation rose higher when she heard. "Now, Cameron, be brave. Go down and tell him once and for all he may just keep what he has, and be thankful. Whatever it is, it's good enough for him, I'm sure." But I still hung back. "It's no use, Marjorie. He'll tell everyone I cheated him. He says he will." "That he shall not," she cried. "I won't have it. I'll go myself and tell him what I think of him and make him stop treating you like this." Some faint glimmer of manliness made me ashamed to allow her thus to fight my battles. "No, Marjorie, not you," I said. "I will go. I'll say what you want me to say." But it was too late. I saw her for just a second at the door, my impetuous, generous little Marjorie, as she flung back her pretty hair in a certain spirited way she had, and nodded to me encouragingly. And then, I can hardly think of it calmly even now, there came a sharp scream and the sound of a fall, and, after that, silence. Sick with fear, I rushed to the head of the steps and looked down into the brown gloom. "Keep where you are for a minute," I heard Ormsby cry out. "It's all right. She's not hurt. Now you can come down." I was down in another instant at the foot of the stairs, where, in the patch of faint light that fell from the door above, lay Marjorie, with Ormsby bending over her insensible form. "She's dead!" I cried in my terror as I saw her white face. "I tell you she's all right," said he, impatiently. "There's nothing to make a fuss about. She slipped coming down and cut her forehead, that's all." "Marjorie, speak to me. Don't look like that. Tell me you're not hurt much," I implored her. But she only moaned a little, and her eyes remained fast shut. "It's no use worrying her now, you know," said Ormsby, more gently. "Just help me to get her round to the kitchen door and tell somebody." We carried her there between us, and, amid a scene of terrible confusion and distress, Marjorie, still insensible, was carried into the library, and a man sent off in hot haste for the surgeon. A little later, Ormsby and I were sent for to the study, where Dr. Daring, whose face was white and drawn as I had never seen it before, questioned us closely as to our knowledge of the accident. Ormsby could only say that he was out in the playground when he saw somebody descending the steps, and heard a fall, after which he ran up and found Marjorie. "I sent her into the schoolroom to bring my paper knife," said the doctor. "If I had but gone myself! But why should she have gone outside on a frosty night like this?" "Oh, Dr. Daring," I broke out, I'm afraid she went out for me." I saw Ormsby's face as I spoke, and there was a look upon it which made me pity him. "And you sent my poor child out on your errand, Cameron? Could you not have done it yourself?" "I wish I had," I exclaimed. "Oh, I wish I had. I tried to stop her, and then it was too late. Please tell me, sir, is she badly hurt?" "How do I know?" he said harshly. "There, I can't speak of this just yet. Go, both of you." There was little work done at evening preparation that night. The whole school was buzzing with curiosity and speculation, while we heard doors opening and shutting around, and the wheels of the doctor's gig as it rolled up the chestnut avenue. I sat with my hands shielding my eyes and ears, engaged to all appearances with the books before me, while my restless thoughts were employed in making earnest resolutions for the future. At last I saw my cowardice in its true light, and I felt impatient to tell Marjorie that I did so, to prove to her that I had really reformed. But when would an opportunity come? I might not see her again for days, perhaps not at all till after the holidays, but I would not let myself dwell upon such a contingency as that, and, to banish it, try to picture what Marjorie would say, and how she would look, when I was allowed to see her again. After evening prayers, read by one of the assistant masters, for the doctor did not appear again, we were enjoined to go up to our bedrooms with as little noise as possible, and we had been in bed some time before Sutcliffe, the old butler, came up as usual to put out the lights. On this occasion he was assailed by a fire of eager whispers from every door. "Sutcliffe! Hi, old Sutty! How is she?" But he did not seem to hear until a cry louder than the rest brought him to our room. "For God's sake, gentlemen, don't!" he said in a hoarse whisper as he turned out the light. "They'll hear you downstairs." "But how is she? Do you know? Better?" "Aye," he said, "she's better. She'll be over her troubles soon, will Miss Marjorie." A low murmur of delight ran round the room, which the butler tried to check in vain. "Don't!" he said again. Wait till morning. Go to sleep quiet now, and I'll come up first thing and tell you." He had no sooner turned his back than the general relief broke out irrepressibly, Ormsby being especially demonstrative. "Didn't I tell you fellows so?" he said triumphantly, "as if it were likely a plucky girl like Marjorie would mind a little cut like that. She'll be all right in the morning, you'll see." But this confidence jarred upon me, who could not pretend to share it, until I was unable to restrain the torturing anxiety I felt. "You're wrong, all of you," I cried. "I'm sure she's not better. Didn't you hear how Sutcliffe said it? She's worse. She may even be dying. I met with the usual treatment of a prophet of evil. 'You young muff,' I was told on all sides. 'Who asked your opinion? Who are you to know better than anyone else?' Ormsby attacked me hotly for trying to produce an alarm, and I was recommended to hold my tongue and go to sleep. I said no more, but I could not sleep. The others dropped off one by one, Ormsby being the last, but I lay awake listening and thinking, until the dread and suspense grew past bearing. I must know the truth. I would go down and find the doctor and beg him to tell me. He might be angry and punish me, but that would be nothing in comparison with the relief of knowing my fear was unfounded. Stealthily I slipped out of bed, stole through the dim room to the door, and down the old staircase, which creaked under my bare feet. The dog in the yard howled as I passed the big window, through which the stars were sparkling frostily in the keen blue sky. Outside the room in which Marjorie lay I listened, but could hear nothing. At least she was sleeping then, and, relieved already, I went on down to the hall. The big clock on a table there was ticking solemnly, like a slow footfall. The lamp was alight, so the doctor must still be up. With a heart that beat loud, I went to his study door and lifted my hand to knock, when from within rose a sound at which the current of my blood stopped and ran backward. The terrible, heart-broken grief of a grown man. Boy as I was, I felt that an agony like that was sacred. Besides, I knew the worst then. I dragged myself upstairs again, cold to the bones, with a brain that was frozen too. My one desire was to reach my bed, cover my face, and let the tears flow, though when I did regain it, no tears and no thoughts came. I lay there and shivered for some time with a stony, stunned sensation, and then I slept, as if Marjorie were well. The next morning the bell under the cupola did not clang, and Sutcliffe came up, with the direction that we were to go down very quietly and not to draw up the window blinds, and then we all knew what had happened during the night. There was a very genuine grief, though none knew Marjorie as I had known her. The more emotional wept, the older ones indulged in little semi-pious conventional comments, oddly foreign to their usual tone. All, even the most thoughtless, felt the same hush and awe overtake them. I could not cry. I felt nothing except a dull rage at my own insensibility. Marjorie was dead, and I had no tears. Morning school was a mere pretense that day. We dreaded, for almost the first time, to see the doctor's face, but he did not show himself, and the arrangements necessary for the breaking up of the school were made by the matron. Some, including Ormsby and myself, could not be taken in for some days, during which we had to remain at the school, days of shadow and monotony, with occasional ghastly outbreaks of the high spirits which nothing could repress, even in that house of mourning. The time passed at last, until it was evening of the day on which Marjorie had been left to her last sleep. The poor father and mother had been unable to stay in the house, now that it no longer covered even what had been their child, and the only two, besides the matron and the one or two servants who still remained there, were Ormsby and I, who were both to leave on the following morning. I would rather have been alone just then with anyone but Ormsby, though he had never since that fateful night taken the slightest notice of me. He looked worn and haggard to a degree that made me sure he must have cared more for Marjorie than I could have imagined, and yet he would break at times into a feverish gaiety which surprised and repelled me. He was in one of those latter moods that evening as we sat, as far apart as possible, in the empty firelit schoolroom. "Now, Cameron," he said as he came up to me and struck me boisterously on the shoulder, "wake up, man. I've been in the blues long enough. We can't go on moping always, on the night before the holidays, too. Do something to make yourself sociable. Talk, can't you?" "No, I can't," I said, and breaking from him, went to one of the windows and looked vacantly out into the blackness, which reflected the long room with its dingy greenish maps, and the desks and forms glistening in the fire beams. The ice-bound state in which I had been so long was slowly passing away, now that the scene by the little grave, that raw, cheerless morning, had brought home remorselessly the truth that Marjorie was indeed gone, lost to me forever. I could see now what she had been to me, how she had made my great loneliness endurable, how with her innocent, fearless nature she had tried to rouse me from spiritless and unmanly dejection. And I could never hope to please her now by proving that I had learned the lesson. She had gone from me to some world infinitely removed, in which I was forgotten, and my pitiful trials and struggles could be nothing to her any more. I was once more alone, and this second bereavement revived in all its crushing desolation the first bitter loss which it so closely followed. So, as I stood there at the window, my unnatural calm could hold no longer. The long frozen tears thawed, and I could weep for the first time since Marjorie died. But I was not allowed to sorrow undisturbed. I felt a rough grasp on my arm as Ormsby asked me angrily, "What was the matter now?" "Oh, Marjorie, come to me," I could only cry. "I can't bear it. Stop that, do you hear?" he said savagely. "I won't have it. Who are you to cry about her, when but for you " He got no farther. The bitter truth in such a taunt coming from him stung me to ungovernable rage. I turned and struck him full in the mouth, which I cut open with my clenched hand. His eyes became all pupil. "You shall pay me for that," he said through his teeth, and forcing me against a desk, he caught up a large T-square which lay near. He was far the stronger, and I felt myself powerless in his grasp. Passion and pain had made him beside himself for the moment, and he did not know how formidable a weapon the heavily weighted ruler might become in his hand. I shut my eyes. I think I rather hoped he would kill me, and then perhaps I might go where Marjorie was. I did not cry for help, and it would have been useless if I had done so, for the schoolroom was a long way from the kitchen and the office of that rambling old house. But before the expected blow was dealt, I felt his grasp relax, and heard the ruler fall with a sudden clatter on the floor. "Look," he whispered in a voice I did not recognize. "Look there." And when I opened my eyes, I saw Marjorie standing between us. She looked just as I had always seen her. I think that even the afterlife could not make Marjorie look purer, more innocent and lovely than she was on earth. My first feeling was a wild conviction that it had all been some strange mistake. "Oh, Marjorie, Marjorie," I cried in my joy, "is it really you? You've come back after all, and it is not true?" She looked at us both without speaking for a moment. Her dear brown eyes had lost their old childish sparkle, and were calm and serious as if with a deeper knowledge. Ormsby had cowered back to the opposite wall, covering his face. "Go away!" he gasped. "Cameron, you ask her to go. She liked you. I never meant it. Tell her I never meant to do it." I could not understand such terror at the sight of Marjorie, even if she had been what he thought her. But there was a reason in his case. "You were going to hurt Cameron," said Marjorie, at length, and her voice sounded sad and grave. "I don't care, Marjorie," I cried. "Not now you are here." She motioned me back. "You must not come nearer," she said. "I cannot stay long, and I must speak to Ormsby." "Ormsby, have you told anyone?" "No," he said, shaking all over. "It could do no good. I thought I needn't." "Tell him," said Marjorie. "Must I? Oh, no, no," he groaned. "Don't make me do that." "You must," she answered. and he turned to me with a sullen fear. "It was like this," he began. "That night when I was waiting for you down there, I had some string, and it struck me, all in a moment, that it would be fun to trip you up. I didn't mean to hurt you, only frighten you. I fastened the string across a little way from the bottom. And then," he had to moisten his lips here before he could go on, "then she came down, and I tried to catch her and couldn't. No, I couldn't." "Is that all?" asked Marjorie as he stopped short. "I cut the string and hid it before you came. Now you know, and you may tell if you like. Cameron, you will never tell, will you, as long as he lives?" said Marjorie. "You must promise." I was horrified at what I had heard, but her eyes were upon me, and I promised. "And you, Ormsby, promise me to be kinder to him after this." He could not speak, but he made a sign of assent. "And now," said Marjorie, "shake hands with him, and forgive him, Cameron." But I revolted. "No, Marjorie, I can't. Not now, when I know this." "Cameron, dear," she said, "you won't let me go away sorry, will you? And I must go soon, for my sake, when I wish it so." I went to Ormsby and took his cold, passive hand. "I do forgive him, Marjorie," I said. She smiled brightly at us both. "And you won't forget, either of you?" she said. "And Greville, you will be brave and take your own part now. Goodbye, goodbye." I tried to reach her. "Don't leave me. Take me with you, Marjorie, dear. Dear Marjorie, don't go." But there was only firelit space where she had stood, though the sound of her pleading, pathetic voice was still in the air. Ormsby remained for a few minutes leaning against a desk, with his face buried in his arms, and I heard him struggling with his sobs. At last he rose and left the room without a word. But I stayed there where I had last seen Marjorie till the fire died down, and the hour was late, for I was glad to be alone with the new and solemn joy that had come to me. For she had not forgotten me where she was. I had been allowed to see her once more, and it might even be that I should see her again. And I resolved then that when she came she should find me more worthy of her. From that night my character seemed to enter upon a new phase, and when I returned to school it was to begin my second term under better auspices. My cousins had welcomed me cordially among them, and as I mastered the lesson of give and take, of respecting one's self and respecting others, which I needed to learn, my early difficulties vanished with the weakness that had produced them. By Ormsby I was never again molested. In word and deed he was true to the promise extracted from him during that strange scene. At first he avoided me as being too painfully connected with the past, but by degrees, as he recognized that his secret was safe in my keeping, we grew to understand one another better, although it would be too much to say that we ever became intimate. After he went to Sandhurst I lost sight of him, and only a few months since the news of his death in the Soudan, where he fell gallantly, made me sorrowfully aware that we should never meet again. I had a lingering fancy that Marjorie might appear to me once more, but I have long since given up all hope of that in this life, and, for what may come after, I am content to wait. But the charge my child friend had undertaken was at an end on the night she was allowed to return to earth and determine the crisis of two lives. There is nothing now to call the bright and gracious little spirit back, for her influence will never leave me. No one seemed to know exactly what to say when the speaker's voice, which had been growing lower and lower, ceased altogether, and the pathetic story of Marjorie's love was at an end. It seemed to the listeners more like a personal confession than any of the preceding tales, and therefore they felt that literary criticism would be out of place. At length someone said it was difficult to recognize the voice. I should be surprised to learn that that boy's life was not a noble and manly one, and I dare say a very happy one, too. Surely hardly any greater blessing can befall either man or woman than to have found and loved an ideal, and then to have had it removed while still wholly noble, and before any experience had come to prove it was but a poor actual after all, and before any hateful discovery had marred the perfect sincerity of worship. I do not know whether this sounds cruel, but it seems true to me. At least I cannot think of any worse fate than to have given one's self wholly in perfect faith to an ideal which one day had collapsed, and stained everything else in life with the dust of its miserable fragments. Nobody ever knew who it was that spoke. Some thought it was Beatrice. Others maintained it must have been the romancer. The next day, before they were fairly awake in the morning, the passengers of the Bavaria knew that they were running into a storm. During the night the motion of the vessel had gradually increased, and by the time it was daylight she was rolling heavily, and the dark green water was above the portholes half the time. Below, the timbers creaked and groaned. Things that were hung against the wall stood out straight with apparently ridiculous disregard of the law of gravitation. The crockery rattled. The stewards stumbled heavily against the partitions as they made their way along the gangways. The big portmanteaus chased the little ones all over the floor, and every now and then a great echoing blow drowned every other sound, as a mountain of water came thundering over the bows and went switching down along the deck over the heads of the scared passengers in their berths. To get up was to face certain wretchedness, and so everybody lay in bed, with or without good cause, until late in the morning. The whole day was a miserable one, but in one way or another it passed, and the weather moderating a little at night, the party, who now sought each other out and clung together like magnetic particles, were seated in a compact group in a corner of the companionway stairs. "One thing is quite certain," Beatrice was saying, "and that is, we will not have another ghost story. We have had 3 tales and 3 ghosts, and another in such dreadful weather as this would be more than anybody could bear." "There is only one person," remarked the tragedian, "whom I feel I can thoroughly depend upon to carry out your wishes. Come," he added, turning towards the editor, "give us a tale of love, or music." "Or both," put in the romancer, and with the promptitude which distinguishes his craft, and the chivalry which is his personal characteristic, the editor did. End of Section 4.